to do with that?
Don't worry, I know my job.
Okay, you're the doctor. What just happened?
This is a reflex.
A reflex?
Yes, a reflex. A reflex sense when you touch something hot. Oh, لما تشك ايدك بالدبوس. Or like when you step on something at the floor.
Mahmoud!
My dad.
No, please no. Cut. Alright, so let's get started. Spinal reflexes. So first of all, what is a spinal reflex? A spinal reflex is an involuntary and nearly instantaneous reaction in response to a stimulus and is controlled by the spinal cord. So it's a quick reaction which is usually controlled by the spinal cord again. The main elements of a reflex are, first of all, the stimulus, the trigger which starts off the reaction. It's a detectable change in the physical or chemical structure of an organism's internal or external environment. So it's the high temperature that you sense suddenly and makes you retract your hand. It's the prick of a pin. It's something that you step on without noticing. These are all stimuli. A sensory receptor is a specialized cell that can detect the stimulus and can generate nerve messages. In your eyes, for example, you have photoreceptors which detect light, exactly. And in your skin, you have thermoreceptors that can detect temperatures. Then we have the sensory or the efferent neurons, which are the nerve cells that carry the nervous messages from the sensory receptors to the nerve centers. The nerve centers being the brain and the spinal cord, the CNS. These are the parts of the nervous system, or the part which receives the information, treats it, processes it, makes a decision, and sends out orders to the body organs. To send the orders, we have the motor or efferent neurons, which are the nerve cells which carry the messages or the orders from the nerve centers to the effector organs. And finally, the effector organs are the organs which receive the orders and perform the response. So I would advise you to copy these definitions on your copybook. These are things that you ought to know. And to make it easier, you can go ahead and look at this diagram here. First of all, the stimulus. It is detected by the sensory receptor, which sends messages through efferent or sensory neurons towards the CNS or the nerve centers, meaning the spinal cord or the brain. Then from there it goes out through efferent neurons or motor neurons to reach the effector organ, which finally performs the response. Another way to see it or to look at it, here we have the stimulus being the pin when you prick your hand with it. So first of all, we have arrival of the stimulus and then activation of the receptor. So we send messages through sensory neurons. Then in step 4, it reaches the CNS, in this case the spinal cord, which processes the information. The spinal cord then gives out orders through motor neurons or efferent neurons, as we said, to reach the effector organ, which is the muscle in this case. And finally, we get the response, which is the retraction of the arm. So what is the pathway of this message, and through which anatomical elements is it done? Okay, so let's first look at the spinal cord again. Remember that the spinal cord is a long tube extending from the brain all the way down your vertebral column in the back. So it's protected by the vertebra. It's located here. The labels that you need to remember about the spinal cord, first of all, this is the gray matter in the middle. This is the outer white matter, regardless of what the colors show in the diagram here. This branch here is the dorsal root. The one below is the ventral root, and this is the spinal nerve. And this sort of a ball here is called the dorsal root ganglion. So just to remind you of the terms dorsal, ventral, anterior, posterior. These are the terms that are of use for us in this lesson. First of all, the side of the back, ميلة الظهر, is called the dorsal side. Towards the bottom or the tummy, it's called the ventral side. Near the face, it's the anterior side, and all the way near the tail, it's the posterior side. Now for humans, since we're upright, you notice that the anterior plane, which is in front of your face, becomes parallel with the ventral one, the abdomen or the tummy, sorry. So if you want to precise a location of an organ, anterior or ventral will mean the same thing in humans. Whereas in animals, anterior is near the face, ventral means near the abdomen. The same thing for posterior and dorsal in humans. Posterior in the back side and dorsal in the back here also. They are in the same plane. Whereas in animals that walk on all four, dorsal is on the side of the back and posterior next to the tail here. Alright, so now we're going to try to discover the pathway of the nervous message through the spinal cord and its branches and its roots. So to do that, we're going to use the experiments done by the physiologist Francois Magendie, which you see here in the photo. Mr. Magendie performed several experiments on dogs, al-kalb, as you can see here. So we're going to have a small simulation of these experiments. And to do that, we're going to have a guest. First of all, al-kalb and Suarez. Now, Mr. Suarez is actually one of my favorite players, so I'm not making fun of him. He's just assisting me in the experiments. It's just a joke. So I have all the respect for Mr. Suarez. No need to feel bad about it. Let's get started. In the control experiment, the dog is actually sleeping here, not knowing that out of nowhere somebody is going to bite his arm. So what happens? Ouch! That hurts. And he raises his arm, as you can see clearly here. So this actually shows us two things. We're going to use this experiment to talk about two ideas. First of all, the ouch, the pain, is sensitivity. It means that afferent or sensory messages has reached the CNS. And the movement of the arm, this is motor activity. It means that messages have reached the muscles of the arm to move, the effectors. So whenever you see these two things, you know that, first of all, sensitivity indicates that the nervous message has reached the CNS from the sensory receptors, and movement or motor activity means that the messages were transmitted from the CNS to the effectors. So I want you to pause the video at this moment and copy these two notes because you're going to use them in the coming experiments. Okay, now we can resume. The first experiment, the spinal nerve. Before we look at the experiment, I want you to prepare your copybooks because I'm going to give you some time to come up with your own significances using what we saw in the previous control experiment. So let's get started. In this experiment, before releasing Mr. Suarez, we're going to first of all section the spinal nerve, as you can see here. We cut it. Section means cutting. Then, go ahead, Mr. Suarez, bite. What happened? He didn't move, he didn't say ouch, there's no sensitivity, and there's no motor activity. So this shows that the spinal nerve, and I'm not going to tell you the answer here. Please pause the video, take a minute or two, try to come up with your own significance, and maybe at the end of the video we'll check if it's correct or not. Okay, now we can resume. Experiment 2. Now the ventral root. So, where's the ventral root? You tell me. Is it this one or that one? Or maybe here? You guessed it. This is the ventral root. We're going to section the ventral root and we're going to perform the same experiment. Go ahead, bite. What happened? Ouch. But he didn't move his arm. So sensitivity is retained, but there's no motor activity. The message was able to reach the CNS, but it wasn't able to reach the muscles. So this shows that the ventral root of the spinal nerve. Pause the video and try to figure out the significance on your own. Well done, let's continue. So experiment 3 now, the dorsal root. So where's the dorsal root? There it is. We section the dorsal root, the same experiment again, bite. What happened now? There's no sensitivity and no movement. So this shows that the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, wait, what's happening here? Who wants shawarma? He raised his arm, he can hear, obviously he doesn't hear from his arm, but he can move his arm. So the motor activity is retained. If he wanted to, he could have moved his arm, but he wasn't able to sense the bite. So that's something worth noting. Pause the video, write your significance, and let's continue. Now we're going to move to the second part of the experiment, set 2. We're going to apply electric stimulations instead of the bites. So again, here we have a sectioned ventral root. This is the cut here. The dog is still sleeping here. The part which is still connected to the spinal cord is referred to as the central end of the section. The part which is at the other end, the periphery, is called the peripheral end of the section. So let's see what we have here. Let's start. So we apply a stimulation at the central end here. Notice that the way to the spinal cord is still open here. However, it cannot go anywhere at this side because it's sectioned. So what was the reaction? Nothing at all. No movement and no sensitivity. So this shows that the ventral root of the spinal nerve, pause the video. Okay, I'm going to give you the significance here. So it cannot facilitate transmission of the nervous messages towards the CNS. Why am I saying that? In this experiment, I know it's not going to go in this direction. I already cut the road. I'm actually challenging it to send messages to the CNS and to do something. The way is open at this side. So I'm giving the stimulus here. I'm actually daring the ventral root to do something. It did nothing. It wasn't able to transmit nerve messages towards the CNS. It has no sensory or afferent, or we use sometimes this term centripetal, yani towards the center. It doesn't have this function. The ventral root cannot send messages into the spinal cord. Okay? Great. So let's look at the second part of the experiment. Let's apply the stimulation now on the peripheral end, meaning at this place here. We apply the stimulation. He raised his arm without feeling anything. So this means there is no sensitivity. The message didn't reach the CNS, but there is motor activity. It did reach the effectors. So this shows that the ventral root of the spinal nerve facilitates, pause the video, write your answer. It facilitates transmission of nerve messages away from the CNS or towards the effectors, meaning it has a motor or efferent, or we use the term centrifugal, meaning away from the center function. Let me explain here. We already know that the message cannot go in this direction. We proved it in the previous part of the experiment. And we cut the part here, cut the way, so it cannot go backwards. We're actually in this experiment daring the message to go in this way, to the muscles, out of the spinal cord. And it actually did, because the arm moved. So the ventral root, despite not being able to send messages into the CNS or the spinal cord, it can, if the road is open or the way is open, it can send messages to the muscles. Very good. So this is the ventral root. So if we put a complete interpretation of the experiment, you can pause the video and copy this on your copybooks. There is muscle contraction of the region innervated by the nerve after stimulation of the peripheral end of the section ventral root. This shows that the ventral root has a centrifugal efferent or motor function towards the effectors. However, there is no response after stimulation of the central end of the section ventral root. This shows that the ventral root has no centripetal afferent or sensory function. It doesn't send messages to the CNS. It's a one-way propagation or sending of messages. Now the dorsal root. So we section the dorsal root again, and again this is the central end, this is the peripheral end. Let's start by applying a stimulation on the central end. Now again, the way is cut from this side, but I'm daring the dorsal root to send messages into the spinal cord. Let's see what happened. So you can see that two things happened. There is sensitivity. He sensed the pain and he raised his arm. He did the complete reflex. Everything worked. So this shows that the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, facilitates, pause the video. Okay, let's continue. Transmission of nerve messages towards the CNS. And eventually it reaches the muscles. So let me explain here what's happening. We know that it cannot go in this direction. The way is cut. It's blocked. we are daring it to go into the spinal cord and to do something, and it actually did, because he did sense pain and he did move his arm. So the dorsal root does have a function to send messages into the spinal cord. Great. Let's try one more. Let's apply the message or the stimulation on the peripheral end of the dorsal root. So here, what happened? Nothing. No pain, no movement. So this shows that the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, pause the video, let's continue, cannot facilitate transmission of nerve messages away from the CNS. It has no motor or no efferent or no centrifugal function. Again, because the way is cut from this side, but it's open from this side. So why doesn't it carry the message in this way towards the muscle? Because simply it cannot do that. It's a one-way transmission. The dorsal root can only carry messages into the spinal cord. The ventral root, as we saw before, only carries the messages away. So you can pause the video on this slide and copy this complete interpretation. There is pain after stimulation of the central end of the section dorsal root. This shows that the dorsal root has centripetal sensory or afferent function towards the CNS. However, there was no response upon stimulation of the peripheral end of the section dorsal root. This shows that the dorsal root has no centrifugal motor efferent role towards the effectors. So notice from all these experiments, when I'm stimulating at the central end, I'm daring it to send messages into the spinal cord. The central end detects sensory functions. The peripheral end detects motor functions because it's still connected to the muscles. So let's look at the slide here again to clarify this point one more time. The dorsal root in both cases was connected to, or the central end, sorry, was connected in both cases to the spinal cord. So when I'm testing the central end, I'm testing for a sensory or afferent function. When I'm testing the peripheral end, I'm testing for an exactly efferent or motor function on both sides. The dorsal root works on the central end because it has a sensory function. The ventral root works on the peripheral end because it has a motor function. Okay, so all together, we come up with at the end with this diagram. This is what we call the spinal reflex arc. If we go ahead and start from the stimulus, where's the stimulus? There it is, the pin. The pin acts on the receptor. It sends messages through sensory neurons through the spinal nerve. Now, which way will it go? Of course, it will go through the dorsal root. The sensory function is from the dorsal root into the spinal cord. We have other neurons called interneurons in here. Then it will leave through the ventral root towards the muscles in order to perform the response. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the spinal reflex arc. By the way, one of the easiest way to remember the sensory function at the dorsal side and the motor function at the ventral side is to look at this hypothetical organism that you see here. Scientists actually tried to visualize, to imagine how come the sensory function is from the dorsal side. Remember, the dorsal side is next to the back here. So they imagined this primitive animal having its legs, as most primitive animals, at the bottom side of the body, at the ventral side. So the legs, the movement is mainly at the bottom, at the ventral side. So that is why the motor function was located closer to the ventral side. And as you can see here, the main sensations, the smelling, the vision, the hearing, are from the dorsal side to sense its surrounding environment. So they imagine that's why the dorsal function has the sensory function, to be closer to the organs related to that, to those functions. And that's all, folks.
Subscribe.